Hey guys, we have a special offer for Radio Rothbard listeners. Ryan has a new book out, Breaking Away, The Case for Secession, Radical Decentralization, and Smaller Polities. Again, this is the secession book you need. I know it's a topic that a lot of you guys are interested in, always a big winner when we have it on the site in our podcasts. And you can get a discount on your copy of this book using the promo code ROTHPOD, that is ROTHPOD. The book just came out. We debuted it at our 40th anniversary event. Ryan has a great talk on the subject. Check it out at our YouTube channel. Everywhere else you can get your Mises Institute content. And so again, that is promo code ROTHPOD, ROTHPOD, and you'll get a 20% off discount on your order. Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. Great show this week. Topic of the day, Alex Jones and the broader weaponization, increased weaponization of the legal system. To discuss that, we have, as always, chief editor at the Mises Institute, Ryan Macon, author of the new book, Breaking Away, The Case for Smaller Polities, available now at Amazon, Mises Bookstore, all sorts of great outlets. Ryan, I know a few weeks ago you wrote an article after the Alex Jones decision on this, kind of helped kick off this topic within our discussions. But since then, we've seen a variety of other battlefronts that I think are relevant to this conversation, really of, again, the way that obviously we've talked in the past about the Supreme Court being always political. We've talked about decaying cultural norms and the politicalization of everything. But when you consider the increasing threat of defamation law as kind of a source of censorship, when we see certain legal battlegrounds, I think creating very political outcomes, there's been some interesting stuff in some of the Russiagate investigations. It seems that we're witnessing, particularly on the left, a very real desire to use courts and laws against people that dare speak out the regime. And obviously, Alex Jones, $1 billion court fine, a judgment on the defamation case is probably not the last time we're going to see a dissident voice given a rather steep price to be paid for saying things that, again, whatever you think about Alex Jones, it's separate from the larger issue of the legal system being used to silence people whose voices people don't like.
Yeah, it was really shocking, really, that judgment came down with a big fine. And really what you have here is someone who was saying unpopular things, and people somehow managed to turn it into a situation where the people who were parents of the Sandy Hook kids were claiming that it was Jones who was responsible for whatever suffering they had endured at the hands of third parties. So it's really quite bizarre. Defamation law is bad enough as it is, in that trying to hold someone who says things responsible for what other people do. But in this case, it was Jones saying some generic things about his opinion about what really happened at Sandy Hook, and the fact that some other people then did things that Jones didn't even tell them to do, then somehow makes him liable for $900 billion or whatever the final judgment was. So that should be regarded as extremely dangerous. If you're just out there saying things, doubting something the government said, and then somebody who listened to you runs out and engages in some sort of harassment. I mean, if harassment was taking place, the people who commit the harassment are the people who should be prosecuted. But of course, that requires a bunch of time and effort on the part of the police, and they would have to go around and investigate each of those things separately, which of course they haven't bothered to do. And so I guess then the solution to that is find some guy that the harassers listened to like months earlier, and then fine that guy hundreds of billions of dollars in civil court. It's really strange logic that's being used here. But defamation logic has always been pretty weak, because the whole premise of it is that people aren't responsible for their own actions, that I said something that you believed and had a free choice in believing or not believing, and then you use that information to go out and do something else totally beyond my ability to control you, and did something, and somehow 3 steps back, I'm responsible for that. So defamation law assumes that people have no free will. It assumes they just believe whatever they hear, and that the person who says things then is somehow responsible for making that robot who heard the thing you say go out and do something. So it's a terrible way of going about any sort of legal standard.
Well, in particular, I think if you look at the details of what Alex Jones said, and again, this is not to litigate the truthfulness of Sandy Hook being a false flag or anything like that, but ultimately the larger narrative was a common theme within InfoWars show, right? And could have been a common theme and a variety of not to use it as necessarily a slur as you would get in mainstream media, but kind of the more conspiracy oriented aspects, particularly of the right, the idea that Sandy Hook was a false flag designed to crack down on gun rights and things like that. And again, Sandy Hook is what it is, right? That was great tragedy, but really, particularly when you factor in that there is FBI agents that were involved within this lawsuit. The actual dynamic here, it's not simply Alex. Again, it's as you mentioned, this wasn't Alex Jones harassing Sandy Hook families in front of their house, calling them mean names. I know there was, I think, some of perhaps the worst statements. And again, to be fair, is there was one father, Robbie Parker, who he directly questioned after some statements he made at a press conference where, impossible to get into the mind of a father who just lost their daughter in a shooting like this. There's some weird mannerisms that he had in it, and Alex Jones brought that up. So that was, I think kind of the most, from what I can tell, I wasn't, daily InfoWars watcher at that time. Just looking at the quotes mentioned from the New York, from a New York Times article, that was one person kind of specified, right? And so maybe that is a little bit different than some of the others. But he wasn't out there saying, "Hey, go attack these families." He talked about investigating the broader dynamic, again, within this skepticism of the way that the government abuses or sometimes sets up certain instances in order to justify the expansion of their own powers, particularly, again, the issue of guns. And again, the fact that you have literal government agents involved within this defamation lawsuit beyond the emotional, kind of arguments made from a parent wrapped up in this case, I think truly highlights, again, that the very dangerous way that this goes directly into anyone questioning government narratives. And I don't think we can take this away from this much broader conversation, right, of misinformation being the great threat to democracy, society, yada, 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 that is being pushed by, just about every Western government leader at this point to justify various attempts of censorship, everything ranging from explicit laws on speech to financial censorship, right? I think these two dynamics are certainly hand in hand, and we can't, it would be a mistake to ignore that very real dynamic there.
Well, if everyone who was a scumbag was liable for huge civil penalties, I mean, that would be in deep, deep trouble. And especially if the state was the one levying those penalties. And yeah, the issue here isn't, hey, is Alex Jones a swell guy? I mean, me, like the vast majority of human beings in this country, didn't place any currency in what Alex Jones was saying about Sandy Hook. This was a tiny number of people. And this idea that, and thus proving that most people are free to ignore what the guy says and are in no way required to take some sort of action or engage in harassment or anything like that. And so Alex Jones is out there saying his own weird stuff. And he's not known for being even like a particularly decent guy. I had a friend in radio years ago. His name was Michael Corbin, and he had his own show with a bunch of weird guests, which I didn't particularly agree with either. But Michael who was a great guy. This was back before Alex was super famous, but it was at the time, it was like in the early 2000s, he was hawking all these videos and everything. And so my friend goes, he volunteers to guest host for Alex Jones so that he could take a vacation or whatever. And he does it, and he says when he got back, he did it for free. And that the next day, his wife calls him, Alex Jones's wife, now ex-wife, calls him on the phone and berates him for like half an hour for not selling enough videos while he was doing the radio show. And basically Mike was just left with the impression these were just the worst human beings imaginable. Quacks hawking low quality video products. And then I guess later vitamins too, and that sort of thing. But of course, you're free to not buy any of that garbage, just like you're free to not listen to the stuff he says. So fine, whatever. The question here is a guy like that, do third parties, well, actually fourth parties. I mean, they're so far down the line, this idea that something Alex Jones said about Sandy Hook somehow makes him responsible for the harassment somebody else did. It has nothing to do with what sort of a swell guy or not Alex Jones is. And I can only guess that a big reason that I saw so much of this stuff, even among people who claim to be anti-government and all that sort of stuff, saying, yeah, Alex Jones, he got what he deserved. I mean, is every scumbag supposed to be subject to huge government fines then? It's just very strange. And then, yeah, as you point out, the worst thing in this was that there was an FBI agent in part of this lawsuit claiming that he underwent, or maybe it was a she, I don't remember, underwent a bunch of emotional torment because of Alex Jones. The idea of an FBI agent suing someone in court for just disagreeing with what the FBI says is just astounding. And historically, fortunately, in this country over the last 50 years, they established that a government agency, at least, now, of course, individuals can still sue, but this is how they used to silence newspapers. So what you had was newspaper reporters would go down to, say, Alabama and report on something having to do with some sort of segregation issue or whatever. And this worked its way up through the federal courts. And the Supreme Court eventually said, well, it's nonsense for governments to be able to sue individuals or private organizations for defamation. Why? Well, it should be obvious, right? Is that it silences criticism from private individuals. So when you have sheriffs suing private individuals for saying nasty things about the sheriff, which is what happened in those cases, it just silences dissent. And so it's a government court siding with another government agency to silence people saying that's defamation. So it was established then. Now, of course, I don't agree with the Supreme Court handing down decisions and saying what some local sheriff can do 1,000 miles away or whatever. But the principle is good. And the principle is that it's insane to let a government agency sue a private individual for saying nasty things about the government, an agency that private individuals are probably taxed to pay for. So that, of course, should never, ever be allowed, and should probably be extended to government agents as well, unless there's some sort of terribly extenuating circumstance, or it has nothing to do with the FBI agent's job, such as like a wrongful death against a neighbor who happens to be a member of the FBI or something like that. And so, yeah, anyone who's on the government payroll who claims that anything related to their government service hurt them due to defamation, that's insane and should not be allowed at all.
Well, and there's an interesting dynamic, I think, as well with this, in that when we look at the Alex Jones case in particular, this is, I think, there's been a variety of court cases related to his statements on Sandy Hook. I believe there was he already had two rulings against him within Texas with multi-million-dollar penalties, judgments against him there. And it was the Connecticut one that caught particular news because it was, again, up close to $1 billion. I believe even still afterwards, the families are looking for, I think, close to $300 billion more on top of that. Again, I don't know how many of those videos in, super male vitality vitamins that Alex Jones is selling. I have a feeling they're never going to get that money one way or another. Of course, again, the larger goal, I think, is to make sure that Alex Jones just simply can't make a living for himself and his family after all this is said and done, right? But I think there's another interesting dynamic, and I think I've noticed this in some other high-profile cases of late, which is this other dynamic where if you look at, I don't know if you watched any of the videos within these court cases, but the interactions of the judges with Alex Jones, right? Like just the clear hatred that these judges had for Alex Jones and everything he represents was just very clear on the surface. We were talking off air, right, about what are the downsides of, conservative and libertarian families not wanting their kids to go to college, is that, well, then you end up with a bunch of, progressive doctors and lawyers. And we've seen in the last few years the way that doctors and lawyers can often have a much bigger impact on our day-to-day lives than the rulings of progressive politicians. And one of the things that I'm worried about is that when you consider the jury pool or the justice system of a Connecticut, right, or a Washington, D.C., that there is this dynamic of, can someone like an Alex Jones, can it really be said that he's being tried by a jury of his peers in this increasingly polarized political world where the jurisdictions themselves have baked within them so many assumptions on politics, on the way we view the world? Like, I think this larger dynamic of, again, these court systems, the reliance upon jury pool. I mean, going back to the examples of, segregation South, right? The concerns about whether a black defendant could be given a true trial by a jury made up of, white folks in Alabama. I think that is increasingly, that same dynamic is very much true if you have a conservative, whether it is a January 6th alleged co-conspirator, whether it is on the other side, an FBI informant giving dirt on, Donald Trump's connections to Putin's Russia in a DC courtroom. How do you feel this increased polarization connected with the court system? Do you think this is the start of a larger trend on the politicalization of these sort of cases themselves in ways that can lead to all sorts of, again, further heightened control or punishment of political opponents?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And the FBI does do this. What they do is they'll shop around for different jurisdictions or to see where they can find a place that you're most likely to get convicted. And you look at these weird cases where people are convicted of breaking some federal law, and then they're shipped off to Washington, D.C., where the crime did not take place. And just imagine I did something that the feds didn't like and they pressed charges. I haven't set foot in Washington, D.C. in like 30 years. And I'm hoping to make it another 30. The absurdity of me being on trial for something in Washington, D.C., right? It's crazy. But that's something that seems to be increasingly common for breaking these obscure, unknowable federal laws that you would have to read thousands of pages even to be aware of. And yeah, you can do that with defamation laws too. You can shop around and you can find states where it's easier to get a conviction. That's what Johnny Depp did. There's a reason he brought his case in Virginia. And there's a reason that it was she who brought the case in England, I believe. I don't even remember what the deals were of that, but it's much easier to get a conviction for slander and libel in the UK. America, which historically has protected free speech more, it's been much more difficult to get convictions here, but all the states aren't the same. And so, yeah, you can shop around, find a place where where the local culture is prejudiced against free speech, much more so than in some other place, and you can get a conviction more easily there. I mean, the laws often do just reflect local ideas, and sometimes the laws just simply don't even reflect current ideas. They're from a more libertarian time of the past, And when free speech is more respected, and if they haven't updated the laws, quote unquote, it's next to impossible to get a conviction on defamation. But I assume that federal agents were advising the families on where to press charges and what to, and how to do it. And yeah, what was Alex Jones doing in Connecticut that was really a violation of Connecticut law? Was he broadcasting from there? I don't believe so. So it's yet another odd way that common sense in law and what historically we would regard as normal in law in terms of a jury of one's actual peers. People are being shipped all over the country to stand trial in these bizarre ways. And you look at how it went historically in the U.S., and I found this fun passage from a historian named Randolph Roth. This is actually from a book on homicide, because he was talking about why some people murdered other people and things like that. And one of them was they felt that their reputations were tarnished, and so there was a whole section in there on like duels and defamation and things like that. And so we did talk about duels, and let's first of all address the issue of duels. But when we talk about this stuff, people they just shrug and they're like, well, if people say nasty things about you, you're going to get sued, and you probably should give them some money because in the past we just did duels. Well, first of all, the legality of duels was hardly like universal. As anyone who follows Alexander Hamilton knows, right? People cross state lines to do duels because it was legal in some states, illegal in others. If you won a duel, that was often just a reason for people to hate you, not to respect your reestablishment of your honor and so on. Throughout history, the church has condemned dueling over and over and over again. The saints condemned dueling over and over again. And so this idea that it's just, that's just what civilization does in place of defamation law. It's not true at all. It's considered uncivilized by most people. Certainly hayseeds out in the countryside somewhere in France, they did duels and things like that. And then somehow the upper class managed to convince people that was a civilized thing. But they singular combat. But that has never been considered compatible with Christianity. And so it's just remarkable for people to shrug and say, no big deal. Just do duels if you can't do defamation law or whatever. But I mean, the reality of it was that early on, as Roth notes, they tried to establish defamation law to cut down on the dueling. But he notes that he says that, sure, people brought defamation cases all the time. He said the desire for revenge was more often satisfied in court by the 18th century, even though half of all slander suits were settled or dropped before trial. And those that ended in guilty verdicts usually resulted in small damage awards. Most suits were intended merely to demonstrate that the plaintiff was a man who would stand up for his rights. They were not meant to bankrupt the defendant. Well, obviously, that doesn't apply to what's going on in Connecticut nowadays, where it's obvious that the whole plan is to bankrupt the defendant. And in these older defamation suits, of course, you had to establish that somebody was directly saying things that led to like serious damages, like a total inability to become employed and things like that. That's not even what people were claiming then in the Sandy Hook case. So historically, it's not even justifiable what happened with this huge fine. And the reality is that it's a case of people thinking long and hard about where can we do this prosecution, where can we take this case, how can we twist the law to get a judgment out of this against Alex Jones? Because just common sense would suggest that you're doing a whole lot of legal acrobatics to come to this conclusion.
And of course, again, the fear here is that this doesn't, again, if you hate Alex Jones, you think what he did is undefendable, fine, whatever. It doesn't stop there. We've already seen, and again, I know the issue of Kanye West goes into a variety of different directions, which we may or may not say for another show. But after and there was a documentary that I believe Candace Owens produced that Kanye West was making statements relative to George Floyd, and pointing out that George Floyd, when he died, had a lethal amount of fentanyl in his system. And the response from George Floyd's family, right, was, we're going to sue him for $250 million with an Alex Jones style defamation suit, because, this is, a similar dynamic. And again, what concerns me is, again, like if you have, when you have the left, you have certain power structures that are again explicitly recognizing that the ability to speak freely invites questions to cherished narratives. And they increasingly cannot rely upon their gatekeepers, like, again, Elon Musk buying Twitter makes it harder to prevent certain narratives from getting out there, right? Does an Elon Musk Twitter stop Hunter Biden's laptop from being discussed 2 weeks before Election Day? Probably not. He's used this as an example of why he's buying it. Can the legal system be used to threaten people saying things that people don't like? And again, this is exactly what these are the concerns, I think, very much out there. And we've already seen this play out. I think that it is so easy to get black-pilled about all of the things all the problems that America has. But of course, if you look outside of the U.S., at the rest of the Western world, outside of the U.S., the ability to speak freely is not there, particularly anymore, right? It's only gotten worse over time. I've got friend, our friend William Yarwood joined us a few months ago talking about the British politics there. He constantly talks about, the very real concerns that, he and his friends have on voicing, political opinions, because of how tight their controls are. The environment that we have here in the U.S. to speak freely is globally fairly rare. And again, I think it is very clear that very powerful people recognize that this is one of the biggest weaknesses that they have right now, and their larger aims of all the devilish schemes that they have for society today.
Well, yeah, that's one of the few places where the U.S. is hanging on by its fingernails is in terms of free speech. I mean, certainly there are threats to it, like this case. But they've still got a way to go to totally stamp it out. We'll see how the Jones case does in appeal, of course. But Canada, right? Terrible on free speech. Europe, terrible. France, especially terrible. I mean, you speak out against the wrong protected group and you can serve prison time. I mean, it's really quite astounding. And they just act like, hey, that's just the price we pay for civilization, is locking people up for saying unpopular things. And so I guess that's acceptable to them. Fortunately, the tradition of free speech is much stronger here. And of course, outside the West, there's even less respect for that. And it's often used by the wealthy to crush the less powerful. The issue of defamation is not just the state. Of course, it's the rich suing the poor into submission. And one case I note here in an article I did on defamation is what happened to Rachel Ehrenfeld. She was a woman. She wrote a book called Funding Evil: How Terrorism is Financed and How to Stop It. The book accused a wealthy Saudi businessman of funding al-Qaeda. So the businessman, Khalid bin Mahfouz, sued Ehrenfeld in a British court. And of course, he had immense amounts of resources, right? And was able to basically cost her an immense amount of money, time, energy. And so you can just see how any wealthy person would be able to do this in all sorts of different jurisdictions. And Rothbard notes this in his own writing, where he says the current system, which allows for defamation suits, discriminates against poorer people, and that it restricts their speech. Quote, they are less likely to disseminate true but derogatory knowledge about the wealthy for fear of having costly libel suits filed against them, unquote. And yeah, he got it. And he was writing this back in the 70s. And the fact, though, that You have to establish harm. You have to establish the person who said the libelous things knew they were false. So it's really hard to actually get a judgment in your favor, with the exception of a few states. Nevertheless, you can tie the person you hate up in court when you're rich for months on end and cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees in many cases. I mean, there's a reason Johnny Depp was able to bring that suit, although he's deeply in debt, apparently. He's still got access to a lot of money. And when you're famous, you can always make more money. Very easy to turn fame into bucks. But for a regular person, what are they going to do? Sued by some sort of Saudi businessman? I mean, he didn't try it in America, of course, because that would have been too difficult, and he was probably angling to get an actual judgment. But in the British court, it was much easier. So, yeah, you then have to get on a plane and go to that other country. It's the fact that people think this is at all acceptable is really a problem for free speech.
One of the issues we have now, too, is that there's kind of these entire networks of, nominally charitable institutions that if they see a case, it's someone who themselves is not personally wealthy, but they have an angle that can really fit, a larger ideological agenda, right? They'll come in and help supplement. They'll provide funding. There's an entire army kind of mobilized right then and there to kind of help these sort of things. And again, I guess this is where, the political battlefield, the less and less trust institutional norms, right? That sort of the soft aspects of political systems that, that we've kind of had in the margins, right? The unspoken rules of politics, the more that those fade away, and again, not that those were ever, golden ages, right? Plenty of stuff, bad stuff was done. But the more that politics becomes explicitly hostile, our team versus your team, friend, enemy distinction, the more you see politics shift again from, attempts at persuading, a theoretical group of swing voters, and more just the mobilization, basically, of political armies at different sort of phases of power. And again, this is a trend that, whether it is, and it's interesting too, because on the other direction, when you have someone like a Donald Trump that is having difficulty finding fancy smancy lawyers to defend him on some of these charges, right? Like that speaks very poorly for the January 6th defender. If Donald Trump can't find competent legal defenders, what luck does a January 6th guy that doesn't have Trump's money have in dealing with these systems? And so again, it's the I think we are all better when the mask drops. These have always kind of been implicit ways the system works. They are becoming more and more explicit. But again, an appreciation for the way these power structures really work. And again, surprise, it doesn't matter. And again, this hopefully is a lesson that the left will, that the right might win if they have success, is that, the idea that we can rely upon Washington, D.C., to enact anti-regime policies. If you can't even win trials in D.C., I think the idea that you're going to convert that city into something that's going to possibly create good outcomes for you is, I think, patently absurd. And this is why we need to have, this is yet another argument for smaller policies, for decentralization, and away from this increased centralization, politicalization, weaponization of political disputes among different factions within the United States of America.
Yeah, it might be a case of really where the underclass is getting larger and is now including people who used to think of themselves as middle class, right? There was always a class of people who were essentially powerless, right? They're described in the old Articles of Confederations as Confederation as paupers and vagabonds and people who basically have no rights in your community because they're not connected to the community economically or socially. And so they're not entitled to the welfare programs and such that did exist in the 18th century. They're considered outside the community in many cases. those people always existed. But now the ruling class seems to be really pressing its advantage so that people who say things we don't like, people who support candidates we don't like, they shall be considered outside the community as well. And I guess the term that George Orwell used was unpersons. These people shall be unpersons because they engaged in wrongthink. And you see a ton of that behavior online, where people who simply say unpopular things, they're not to be treated as regular people, but as monsters who need to be silenced. So I do see more and more of that. How much it extends into real life outside of Twitter, which isn't a real place, as that one comedian said when they tried to destroy him on Twitter. He's like, it's not a real place. I guess as long as you have your base of fans, it's okay. But I think it does feel to many people that the odds of falling into that group of the truly powerless and the unrepresented have grown in recent years, and that is a very real threat to people who perhaps once considered themselves not subject to that at all.
I think that covers this topic. For Ryan McMakin, this is Tho Bishop. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.